Welcome to Playful Beginnings, a podcast about the magic of play therapy for therapists, students, and anyone interested. In our podcast, we'll explore the deeper understanding of play therapy and the skills we use when working with children.
We hope to help you understand the why behind what we do and how it helps kids heal and grow. I'm Dr. Kristie Opiola, a working play therapist and university professor in North Carolina.
I'm Maggie Parker, a play therapist and professor in Virginia.
Hi, Maggie. It's good to see you.
Good to see you. Hi, Kristie.
I thought today we could talk a little bit more about kind of the playroom and some of the things of what it looks like, maybe from a different direction. So I know previously we talked about forming safety and allowing kids to express themselves and this idea of freedom or like choice in the playroom. And I'm guessing that some people might feel uncomfortable with that. Like this play space might be a free-for-all, that children can behave however they want in the playroom.
Makes me think of my kids are always like, John Cena, and like use their elbows and jump on someone.
Yeah, or can destroy things or hit us, or some of the challenges that maybe families come in their intake and share about their kids. And I think when we first talked about it, we didn't really talk about the other side of when kids are coming to us who, have really big emotional feelings that are causing more disruptive behaviors and how that might show up in the playroom, and then kind of the skills that we use to help kids learn regulation skills, learn self-control, those types of things.
I mean, I think we've talked about too, how both of us are pretty permissive, but we have boundaries as to what I don't want to be hit. That's just like, I don't like it. It's not fun for me. And so it's really pretty intentional, I think, on one, trusting that a child can self-regulate.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the hardest parts about these type of situations where there's a lot of behaviors in the playroom where it feels really dysregulated, or maybe I think a lot of times, like for clinicians, especially, aggression feels really scary in the playroom. And so I think the first thing is, how do you remain calm?
Mm-hmm.
And we talk about this with parents and like the thermostat versus the thermometer, because if kids are elevated and then we become elevated, we're all just elevated. And
I call it volcanoes.
Yeah.
Everyone's exploding.
Yeah. And so my job is to remain calm and to display that trust in the child that I believe you can bring yourself under control. I believe in your capacity to do this. And we're really intentional about how we say that, right? So the first thing is to express what we think they're feeling. That helps them feel connected, I think, because instead of just stop that.
Yeah. And I think understood. So not just connected, but they feel more understood by the therapist, so that we all know, right? Like if people tell us we're wrong or we need to do something different and we're in an agitated state, I'm not just automatically most likely to do something different, especially if I'm really agitated, right? I'm going to probably continue to kind of misbehave or express these intense feelings I'm having, or feel really isolated, alone in it, right? So I just continue to drown in those emotions.
One of the things I talk about is if you're having a bad day at work or your boss tells you that you suck, something, I don't know, and you call your friend, do you want them to say, well, what did you do wrong? What could you do differently? Or, wow, that really hurts.
Looking for an activity. Oh, I do have it here. I really think it's cute. There's if people haven't read this book, I think it aligns really well with play therapy, but it's How to Talk So Kids Will Listen and How to Listen So Kids Talk by Adele Faber and Eileen Maslish. But I think it's on page 5.
I love that you know exactly where this is.
Oh, I've used it quite a few times. No, it is on page 5, but it gives like an adult scenario, right? And before we jump into it, I want to talk about what Maggie started to talk about, is this idea of limit setting children's behavior. Well, anything, when kids are in big emotional feelings, they want to feel heard emotionally first. But if we want to help kids regulate, right, that's really the first step to any other skill that we're going to use, is to really convey our understanding to them. And then if we're going to do more trying to help them control their behavior or the way they're expressing their emotions, right, then we would do something we call limit setting. We use a model to limit setting. We call it ACT, which is you're going to acknowledge the feelings, desires, wants, and needs of the kiddo. We're going to communicate a limit in a very clear fashion, and then we're also going to target an alternative. But Maggie, what you were talking about, right? This idea of like, what do we, when we call our friends, how do we want them to respond? The how to talk so kids will listen and how to listen so kids will talk has a little activity, and they give an adult scenario for adults to be thoughtful of, right? And then they share the way that people typically respond. And there's 8 different ways people respond. So they either deny the person's feelings, they either just tell them they shouldn't feel that way or that feeling is wrong, or they become very philosophical. What life is intended to be hard. We're supposed to have challenges, all these like philosophical. So you almost feel like they're not even listening or hearing you, or right, they're not really getting what's happening, or they give you advice. They tell you what to do.
Mm-hmm.
Or they kill you with questions, right? They're wanting all the details. Their curiosity takes over. And sometimes those questions have implications to them. And so they feel hurtful. They can also defend the other person that you're talking about,
Mm-hmm.
right? So defend your boss, defend a peer, defend your partner, whatever it is. So it almost feels like they've sided with someone else, or they pity you, right? They do a lot of sympathy, and often that feels disingenuous.
Mm-hmm.
Or they try to psychoanalyze you, right? So they go back to, is this an issue from your childhood? And no, 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 from your parents, and no, no, no.
What is
And
this triggering in you?
then, right.
That drives me nuts.
I know. And then last is like an empathic response. So they attempt to attune to how you're feeling and can reflect that to you,
Mm-hmm.
right? And the activity is fun because you get an opportunity to write your reaction to each of these. So based on the scenario, they give you kind of some examples, and you can kind of write how that makes you feel. And what I have found, I use this with my students. I also teach a parenting class, and I use this in the parenting class as well. I would say the majority of people like the empathic response the most.
Yeah.
Right. Really, which is attuning to how you're feeling emotionally.
Mm-hmm. And I think too, what you were talking about that was really neat about that exercise is, how do you feel when these things are said to you? Because we often communicate with each other and with children without thinking how people may be making meaning of that experience. And so, or what messages we may be sending. And so that's another part of, we've talked about how this kind of shaped our relationships too, is starting to remember, like, what am I telling this person if I'm like, oh, don't worry about it, it'll be fine. Right. That feels really minimizing, and that doesn't feel good. And I don't want someone to say that to me. And so what's going on with me in that moment, usually it's because that feels big and emotional, or I don't have enough time to deal with it. And so then my response is basically, this is too big, it'll be fine, I don't want to deal with it.
Yeah.
And so we're really thoughtful in the room as to what messages we're sending the child. And it starts with ourselves, right? So am I getting angry? What is my facial tone? My face look like? What is my vocal tone? How am I sounding in this moment? Because that I could be sending the message, I'm actually not okay with this and you're in trouble, or I'm rejecting this part of you. And then recognizing their emotions to help them feel understood and valued. And so it starts with your own self-regulation. And it starts with, how do we understand what they're experiencing, to help them identify it in themselves. And then, we haven't the rest of it. I don't know if you want to go into now, or stating the limit or communicating the limit. I always get very confused with the ACT model, because ACT, it does communicate the limit, doesn't make sense to me. Say it.
I think either one works.
Yeah.
So when we go to so we use this model to help kids feel recognized, feel heard, and share that a behavior is not okay. So if they were going to hit me or want to scratch me, I would want to communicate that's not okay, right? Like, I'm not okay with that. If they want to break a toy, I would also communicate, right? So whatever the misbehavior that's happening is, we're going to communicate if that's socially acceptable or not. And if it's not, we're going to help them try to correct the behavior. And so we want to communicate that. And what we find is, for really young kids, it's hard for them to problem solve in that moment. So we'll also share some better ways of them expressing themselves. So we might point out some ways that they could get that need met or that desire met in just a more appropriate way in the playroom that's not going to harm me, harm them, harm a toy. So we do use things like limit setting to help regulate a behavior. I find older kids don't always need target. They can often problem solve that on their own. And so I might just share my understanding of how they're feeling or that desire, want, or need that they have, and then share that like people are not for hurting or toys are not for destroying or whatever the limit may be in the play space. We also, which is interesting for some therapists or people who work with kids, is we actually don't post these limits up in the playroom. We want to convey trust in the child that we wait until the event is occurring before we share it with them. So they're not trying to rigidly fit in a set of rules, right? They can creatively figure out how to be in the playroom to express themselves.
Yeah, I think that's important is,
Mhm.
you never set a limit until a limit needs to be set.
Mhm.
And also the way in which you were saying the limit is really important. So short, and it's like not up for argument, right? So
Yeah.
if you say, we don't do that in here, one, I'm not engaging in that behavior. So saying we is not
And you're not reacting to
accurate,
the behavior, right? You're staying
right?
calm and collected as you're sharing this message too.
Yes. And I forget what the example I just gave, but you don't want it to be left up for argument, right? Well,
Yeah, you
we're
don't want
not,
to power struggle between
yeah.
you and the kid.
So it's like, we don't do that in here is
Mhm.
kind of like, I'm doing it right now. So like,
Yeah.
what do you mean? And so the way we set them and what you were saying is very calmly and succinctly, and where they're non-negotiable. I'm not for hitting. Toys aren't for breaking. Walls aren't for painting. Hammers aren't for throwing. All sorts of kind of things in that way. And so it's just, nope.
We also, not only do we try to say it in a way that is not arguable, but we try to make it short and sweet so that kids can comprehend it.
Right.
Adults handle a lot of monologues, right? Where we start to sound, or I think kids tune us out. So for those of us who are older, right, we sound like the Charlie Brown teacher where it's just want, 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 want. They just tune us out when we go too long. So we try to make it as short and sweet and to the point as possible so that they can take it in. We also believe that the child can get themselves under control. So we're going to give them the opportunity to do that, right? So I might repeat this limit several times in the play space for them to get it. And then if they're struggling, I'm going to maybe give them some alternatives of, if they continue to do this, there might be a consequence to that in the playroom, such as if they're throwing sand and sand is not for throwing, sand is for staying in the sandbox and they continue to throw it. I might say, it looks like you've chosen to be all done with sand for today. We also don't believe in long-term consequences in the playroom. They're short-term. We want to give them a lot of opportunity to learn regulation skills. So we don't want to take it away for, several sessions in a row. It will just be for today, and then next session they can come in and play with it again.
Yeah. And I think that's one thing when I explain limit setting to parents and even students too, is there's sometimes an anxiety or an expectation, like there's an expectation that they should abide by the limit within the first try, and then an anxiety when they don't. And it's like, oh no, these are kids. Like
But
this
not
is
even
going to take a while.
adults don't do that.
Adults don't do that.
Why do we expect kids to be so just compliant in the moment? And as an adult, I don't know, I hope we have more regulation tools in our toolbox to help us regulate in these moments that I could get myself under control. And maybe I choose not to. But,
Yeah.
kids are learning those tools to add to their toolbox. So they don't always already have them available to them.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. And I think it's really neat to watch it happen in the playroom. And I also, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I maybe it's because I have a lot of faith in children and I really strongly believe in their abilities, but I always love how surprised people are that 2-year-olds can do this, get themselves under control when provided an environment that allows them time to kind of figure it out, to trial and error, and to ultimately get themselves under control. And I always show a video in my class of a kiddo who is really dysregulated and is needing to get themselves under control. Right. I set the limit. The child struggles. I set the limit again. The child continues to struggle. I set the limit again. The child continues to struggle. I move on to a different skill that kind of has a consequence to it. The child is compliant with that side of the consequence, but expresses how hard that consequence is for them in the play session. And why I say I really love the thing is because it all takes 6 minutes and 32 seconds from start to finish for this child to get themselves where they can give up on something that they have a strong desire for. And that incident did not happen again in the play session after that. So in 6 minutes, right, they figured out that, oh, when I have these desires and I really want to do these things, I have to figure out a way to do this in a way that is acceptable and is not going to be harmful. And I can still get that need met, right? Like by doing this in a different way. And they figured it out instead of like not getting the opportunity to play with this toy again, or, have it taken away multiple times over multiple sessions. Some kids need that, some don't, right? But we want to give them those opportunities to practice it in a safe place with minor consequences, right? So they can figure out what that looks like of how do I get myself under control when I'm struggling? How do I manage wanting that candy bar at the counter and asking my adult for it and they say no, and we don't want them to steal it or like do something extreme. So how do I manage those moments in real life? Those get played out in the playroom, and that's one of the cool things I think that can happen. There's lots of wonderful things that happen in the playroom, but it really is reassuring to see kids' abilities to do that frequently in the play space.
When it also, I think there's a lot of language focused on choice, like when you choose, because then it helps them also recognize that they are in control of themselves and they have choices that they can make. I think a lot of times it's much easier to blame stuff on other people. Well, you did this, or you made me angry, or and so this is really focused on like, okay, so you're making a choice, like, and that's okay. And letting them know that there are other choices that they can make. And I am hesitant as to like how to share this story, because you talk about kind of consequences. And I think, it's not consequences as in like you have to go to your room, right? Which is more punishment. I had someone who the limit was really important that they played out, and they needed to play it out each week, and they needed to see how I would respond in that. And so I got supervision because I was starting to struggle in how to accept this child, and really uncovered some of my struggle was they're pouring bubbles on the floor, which is really hard to clean up. Like bubbles are slippery and sticky, and I had to go to class right after. And so I was scared of being late. And so I was like, okay, so this seems really important. The limit is not something that this person is able to do in this moment, right? Like there's something about it that is meaningful and that they're struggling with. And so then it became, okay, one, I can put less bubbles in the container. Okay.
Correct.
Check. That helps me have less to clean up. And then the limit became, if you choose to pour those on the floor, you choose to leave 5 minutes early so I can clean them up.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was quote unquote the consequence of like, if you choose to do this, that's fine. And you choose to leave early so I can clean it up. That way I was able to accept her in those moments and really understand and let her play out what she needed to without kind of that bothering me or getting in the way of our relationship, if that makes sense. And I think the more you can do natural consequences for parents and teachers and caregivers, that's the best. Debating if I should tell this story because I feel like it's a personal one, but it's so funny.
Well, and I think the other thing that you're speaking of here, Maggie, right? Like is the other thing that happens in a play therapy space is we use a lot of decision making or returning responsibility to the kiddo to help them feel the weight of responsibility when there's not really a ton of weight on their shoulders, right? Like consequences or punishment, right? Like when you're given a choice of punishment, that's a lot of weight to make a choice over. But in the playroom, we offer children opportunities to practice minor weights that they can make a choice of, right? So, and they're small things. What color should I paint this flower? And here you can decide, right? That is a returning that responsibility to the child so they feel the weight of it. But what I find that it really helps with in the long run, not only them being able to make decisions, but also taking responsibility for choices and actions that they make.
Yeah.
I have a kiddo that I'm working with, and she's kind of has done a little bit of regression. And so she's showing kind of where we were, months ago is showing back up in the playroom as some new challenges have come up in her life. She walked out of our session last week and said, I chose to leave the session early today because I chose to destroy it. Right. And I was,
Yep.
okay. Right. But like she could say it freely.
Yeah.
No guilt, no anything to it, right? She understood that the choices that she was making during our time meant that session was going to be a little shorter because the reality is our schedules are stacked often with clients, right? Or your schedule, you'll have clients back to back to back. And if one kid really destroys the room, and it's going to take you 20 minutes to clean it up, that means your next session's going to be late. We don't
Right.
build 20 minutes into our schedule. And so that freedom, and she didn't feel judged by me.
Right.
That's the other thing, like my acceptance of her need to do that also balanced her desire to want to do that. And she felt comfortable to ending session early so that she could make that choice.
Yeah.
Right. Or take that responsibility on and then shouted it to the rooftops of the choices that she was making in those moments.
She's so proud of herself. And I think, yeah, that was when a 3-year-old did not want to wouldn't get dressed, right? Like it wasn't happening. And would, the caregiver would put a shirt on and they would take it off and like put it on and take it off. And finally it was like, okay, if you choose not to put a shirt on, you choose to go to school without a shirt on.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of looks in the parking lot. There are a lot of people staring at this 3-year-old walking through a cold parking lot in, March, I think, going into the lobby, going down the elevator, walking past all the classrooms and going to class. And of course, the caregiver brought shirts and just said, if they choose to put a shirt on, they're right here. And so someone later was like, hey, you didn't have a shirt on today. And they go, I chose not to. I was like, oh, that's great. Right. And so that's sometimes their choice and abiding by a limit isn't necessarily them stopping this behavior that we're maybe uncomfortable with. Sometimes it's making the choice to do that, understanding that they are making a choice and there are subsequent choices after. And that's so important. I don't know. It was a fun little experience. It was me. I was the caregiver. It was me. It was my child.
Well, and I also think the idea of you might feel different about this, Maggie, but like for me, as just a point of like societal reference, like I have kids, there's some kids that just prefer to be clothless.
Mm-hmm.
I would much rather explore this world with the least
In their natural state.
Their natural states. Yes, right. But societally, that's really not an option. Like we're in 2024. The idea that a kid can just walk around my playroom, shirtless or bottomless is just not okay. Right. So even like little things like that, helping to set societal standards, like as a parent, those are okay choices to make. Sometimes as a play therapist, I'm going to be a little more restrictive of kids.
Clothes are for staying on.
Clothes are for staying on. Yeah.
One of
and a consequence. So I had a little kid who actually chose to pour water on their clothes. And then, oh no, they're all wet. And so then they were like proceeded to try to take them all off. It was a young little kiddo. And it was like, oh, I know you would really like. And here's another really important thing when you're talking about a lot of these skills is they have to be done with a lot of empathy. Right? They can't be reactionary responses. They have to be empathically stated, where you show like you understand the level of distress, the level of like emotional pain that they're in, right? And clothes are first aid.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, no, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I have another funny story of my first ever play session, like real play session. So not practice in school, but with a real client. And you're taking this class and your professor is one of the people that writes the book. So no pressure, right? So I'm in the playroom and I'm reflecting and all of this. And all of a sudden, this little bitty takes the scissors and cuts their hair. Like before. And I'm like,
can't even respond quick.
Yeah, you really want to cut your hair. Hair is not for cutting. You can choose. And like, she's already like gone over here and now has bangs. And I like before I can even get anything out. And I remember going to supervision and being like, oh my, what did I do? And they're like, next time you could just put your hand out and move the scissors. I was like, looky there. Looky there. And I went and talked to the mom and I'm so sorry. And she's like, oh, she does that all the time. But then thinking about trust, the same person a year later, we were sitting at the craft table and she wanted to brush my hair and there are scissors right there. And I was like, oh, geez. I was like, I'm I had to, and she just brushed my hair. It would, I had to really trust her. And I think that was helpful for her to see how much I trusted her.
Yes.
So it felt important in that moment. But yeah, man alive, I'm like, cut their hair. Whew.
Yeah. I'm trying to think. So we talked about like limit setting. We alluded to choice giving, which is another
Mm.
thing we can give. And there's all different types of choices we can give kids. We can give kids choices that are kind of like positive choices. You can choose this or you can choose this, and both are totally acceptable to the child and you. Or you can use choices as consequences, right? Where you can help kids like process through heavier weighted. So one is like a socially desirable choice, and then one is a choice that has a consequence. Now, I will warn therapists because it's our I think people in general, it's our natural tendency that we want kids to do what we want them to do.
Yes.
And so we will almost sabotage the choice giving by giving one that's really not an option,
Right.
right? Like it makes no sense. So then it becomes a threat instead of a choice. No matter what type of choice, they both have to be acceptable overall choices where one doesn't feel like a threat to the other one.
And you have
And
to be, oh, sorry. I was going to say, you have to be ready too if they come
mhm,
up with their own choice.
if they have an
Because,
alternative that's acceptable.
mhm. And I think sometimes that's hard because we want to be in control and it feels, but they also want to be in control. And so if they've come up with a choice, that was, yeah, so many stories. It was in our intro to play class. I don't know if you remember. Someone was talking with their child and it was like, if you can choose to keep yelling and leave the restaurant, or you can choose to stop yelling and stay in the restaurant. Which do you choose? And she goes, I choose to poop. It's like, all right, let's go to the bathroom.
Well, that works.
That works too. Sometimes you need to yell when you need to go poop, and that's okay. So we'll
Yeah.
go potty. So just kind of, it's fun when they come up with their own things.
And I think the amazing things in particular, when children are coming up with consequences, they're often much harder than you would give them ever a consequence. Like children tend to be really hard on themselves, just like people tend to be really hard on themselves. And so, also being like, that could be a choice. You can choose that. And you also have this choice, right? That feels a
Mhm.
little softer and more like learning focus. Like, I won't be able to play with this toy until 2027. Not realistic. That's a long time. You're not even going to be interested in that toy in 2027. But for the rest of today, yes.
Yeah. Have you had that
And
happen in session? Yeah, where they're like, oh, like will you tell the story? I'm interested how it played out. Or you can
the
make one up.
no. I'm trying to remember exactly what they did. I know their response in the moment was, then I can't play with this until I'm like 13 years old. And like in my head, I'm like, wow, that's 5 years from now. And you won't be seeing me when you're 13. Like hopefully you're
Mhm.
not still in therapy at 13. That's not my plan for you. And so like I gave a smaller choice and he picked the until I'm 13 because it was his idea. And then
Okay.
the next week he came in and he was like, Miss Kristie. And I was like, yeah. He's like, last time I said I didn't want to play with this until I was 13. And I was like, I do remember that, right? Like I was just
Mhm.
responsive saying that. And he's like, that's a really long time away. Because it was said in the heat of the moment when we're
Right.
not right? Like we're not reasoning things out. And so he was, I wonder if maybe we could look at that again. And he's 8, so he's can comprehend this a little bit more than, like my 3 and 4 year old kids that I see. And I was like, I think that's reasonable. We can revisit that. And he was like, I think maybe I can't play with it last week or this week, but next week I can choose to play with it. And I was like, if that feels good to you, he's like, yeah, I think that's better. Right. And then in the next session, he came in ready to play with it, but he didn't even touch it that session. Right. So talk about self-control
Wow.
and him able to like problem solve kind of those
Hmm.
scenarios. Right. That's the really, I think, neat thing about being in the playroom. I didn't
Hmm.
like hardcore live to his decision to not play with something till he was 13 because the reality is that's not a realistic limit. But
Yeah,
yeah,
that's
yeah, it's
fun.
so funny.
Yeah, it's fun in the room to see what they come up with. But
I'm trying to, and I don't know if we've covered them all. I think the other one you touched on in our last session is kind of like the encourage and esteem building kind of statements that sometimes help kids in who are struggling in regulation.
mhm. Yeah,
Right. So like
you decided to do that instead, or Mhm.
that, or you're determined, you're sticking with it. And sometimes I share my faith in the child, like, I really believe in you that you can figure this out. Spelling tends to be a big issue in my playroom. Is it a big
Mhm.
issue?
It has been a couple of times, I think. And honestly, I didn't really know how to respond. And also, it was like both math and spelling, and I didn't know the answer. I was like, I really don't know. You really want me to tell you what the answer is? And I truly don't know. Like, your math is confusing.
Yeah. And the cool thing in the playroom is it does not matter if they get the math correct or incorrect, right? So
Mhm.
we have the luxuries of it more being about the process, what is challenging them and causing them dysregulation than the final product, the results of it, that they got this math problem. We'll say I do see kids do a lot of school related things in my playroom.
Mhm.
So they will play out. Like if they have difficulty with spelling will be an area that they will try to spell everything in the playroom. Or one kiddo labeled all the shelves, the masking tape on the front of the shelves, and then wrote the name. It started on the animal shelf, which has so many names.
Love it.
Like there's a lot of toys on our animal shelves, right? Like all the different animal families. And she was really struggling to spell alligator, right? And returning it to her. And here you can spell that how you want to. No, there's a right and a wrong way. Oh, you feel a lot of pressure of getting this right. In here, alligator is spelled however you would like it to be spelled.
Mhm.
And we struggled back and forth. She kept going back and forth. And then finally she like spelt it and she's like, I think that's pretty close. Like
Oh,
she
that's
was so
adorable.
proud of herself. Uh,
Yeah.
right. We only got to 3 animal families in the 45-minute session because her need for perfection, or her need for social acceptance in doing something the right way versus the wrong way.
Yeah.
And then when she left, she said, please don't remove these because I need to finish this next week. And our playrooms go back. They get reset every
Yeah.
time. So, we untape it. And she came in the next week and she said, who took my tape off?
I know.
Oh, you're really upset that that's gone. I bet another kid took that off, which is another great thing we can process, right? Like
Mhm.
retaliation, not thinking that people want to believe, whatever. But all wonderful things that kind of get processed in the playroom and shared in our space with them.
Well, this was really fun.
As
Appreciate
you can
it.
tell, we talk about this stuff forever.
Yeah. Yeah.
Exciting.
And we will in many, many more episodes, hopefully. I feel like I need to say like and subscribe. I don't even know what that is. So, anyways,
Just keep listening.
yeah.
Just keep listening, and we can't wait for you to be a part of our next episode.
All right. Bye, Kristie.
Bye, Maggie. Bye,
Have a
everybody.
good day.